Imagine being told that you are not the first attempt. That before you, before your parents, before every ancestor whose name has been forgotten, there were other humans. Different humans made from different things, and every single one of them failed. That's not science fiction. That's not a fever dream. That's the opening chapters of one of the oldest surviving creation stories on Earth. A document so strange, so specific, that it describes humanity being built, destroyed, and rebuilt, not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. The book is called The Popol Vuh. Maybe you've heard the name. Maybe you haven't. Either way, chances are you don't know what's actually inside it. This isn't some obscure footnote in an anthropology textbook. This is the sacred narrative of the Xquic Maya, a people who lived in the highlands of what is now Guatemala. And according to this text, the gods didn't get creation right on the first try. They didn't even get it right on the second try. First, they tried animals. Deer, birds, jaguars, all spoken into existence by divine will. But animals couldn't speak the names of their makers. They couldn't offer praise, they couldn't remember. So the gods moved on. Then came the mud people. Bodies formed from wet earth, crumbling, shapeless, dissolving back into the ground almost as soon as they were made. A civilization of clay that couldn't even hold its own form long enough to worship anything. After that, wood. Humanity carved from trees, walking, talking, multiplying across the land. But something was missing inside them. No hearts, no memory. No gratitude toward the sky and the earth that made them. And when their own tools and animals turned against them, when the world itself seemed to reject their existence, a flood came to wash them away. Some say their descendants still swing through the trees today, watching us with something like sorrow. We'll get to that, and only after all of that, after failure piled on failure, do we reach the story most people associate with Maya mythology. 2 brothers, the hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, sons of a father who was tricked, murdered, and left as a warning in the Underworld. Their journey takes them down into Xibalba, the Maya land of death, a realm ruled by lords with names like 1 Death and 7 Death, where every test is designed to kill you, and where losing means far more than losing a game. Their victory down there, against gods far older and far crueler than they are, becomes the reason humanity as we know it exists at all. The Maize people, us, according to this story, made not from mud, not from wood, but from corn, the crop that fed entire civilizations for thousands of years. 3 failed humanities, a flood, a rebellion, an underworld, and 2 brothers who had to outsmart death itself before the story we're living in could even begin. Over the next while, we're going to walk through this entire narrative slowly, the way it was meant to be heard, the way it was likely told around fires for generations before anyone ever wrote it down. So get comfortable, settle in, let your mind drift into a world of gods, still figuring out how to make something worth keeping. If you're listening to fall asleep tonight, that's exactly why I make these. So tell me, where are you right now, and what time is it there? I love reading the comments and realizing this is playing in Tokyo before sunrise, and in Chicago right before midnight, all at the same moment. And if you want to support the show, the easiest way is following on Spotify. The link is right there in the description. Costs nothing, takes a few seconds, and it genuinely helps keep these stories coming. Now let's go back before the sky had a name, before the earth had a shape, back to when there was nothing at all except silence and water and the faint stirring of gods who hadn't yet decided what to create. But before we return to that silence, before we drift back into a world without shape, it's worth pausing to ask a simple question. How do we even know any of this? How does a story that predates European contact with the Americas end up sitting in your hands, or in this case whispering through your headphones? centuries later? The answer is more fragile than you might expect, and honestly, a little unsettling once you sit with it. The Popol Vuh belonged to the Xquic Maya, a people who built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the highlands of what is now Guatemala. Long before any of this was written down the way we know it today, these stories lived somewhere else entirely. They lived in memory, in voice, in the rhythm of elders speaking to children around fires, in temples, in ceremonies tied to the turning of seasons and the movements of stars the Quiche tracked with startling precision. This was oral tradition in its purest form. Knowledge passed mouth to ear, generation after generation, refined and repeated so many times that every word probably carried weight most of us can barely imagine. And then the Spanish arrived. You probably already know the broad strokes of what happened next across Mesoamerica. Conquest, disease, the deliberate, systematic destruction of indigenous religious and cultural material, often by Catholic missionaries who saw these traditions as something to be erased rather than understood. Countless texts, artifacts, and oral histories vanished during this period. Entire belief systems that had existed for centuries were pushed towards silence in the span of a single lifetime. The Popol Vuh very nearly went with them, sometime in the mid-1500s, likely between 1554 and 1558. An unknown Xquic author, or more likely several authors working together, made a decision. They took the oral tradition, the sacred stories their people had always spoken rather than written, and they transcribed it using the Latin alphabet, which Spanish missionaries had introduced to teach the Quiche language phonetically. This wasn't the original pre-Columbian version. That version, if it ever existed as a physical text at all, has never been found. Some scholars believe there may have been earlier hieroglyphic books, Maya codices, that recorded parts of this mythology before the conquest. If they existed, they're gone now, most likely burned, along with so much else. What survived was this later transcription, written in Quiche, hidden away, passed quietly within the community for generations. It stayed largely unknown to the outside world for well over a century. Then, around 1701, a Spanish Dominican friar named Francisco Ximénez arrived in the town of Chichicastenango in the Guatemalan highlands. Ximénez was different from many of his contemporaries. He'd actually taken the time to learn Quiche, along with several other Mayan languages, and he seems to have developed something closer to respect for the culture he was supposed to be converting, rather than simple contempt. Somehow, he gained access to that Quiche manuscript, and instead of destroying it, he copied it. Ximénez transcribed the original Quiche text word for word, and then, alongside it, added his own Spanish translation, creating a bilingual manuscript with the Quiche and Spanish running side by side. Whatever his personal motivations were, faith, curiosity, scholarly instinct, we can't know for certain. But that single act of preservation is the reason we have access to this mythology at all today. Without Ximénez, the Popol Vuh likely disappears into the same silence that swallowed so much of Mesoamerican spiritual history. Because of the depth and scope of what it contains, creation, destruction, gods, the underworld, moral lessons, cosmic order, scholars eventually began referring to the Popol Vuh as the Maya Bible. It's not a perfect comparison, and it's one that can flatten some of the nuance of Quiche belief if taken too literally. But it captures something true about the text's importance. This wasn't just a story, it was a foundation, a way of explaining where the world came from, why humanity exists, and what obligations the living owe to the gods who shaped them. For a long time after Ximénez's transcription, the manuscript sat in relative obscurity, passed between libraries and private collections in Europe. It wasn't until the 19th and 20th centuries that scholars began seriously translating and studying it, recognizing what they were actually holding. a rare direct link to a mythology that had almost been erased entirely. And it's within that mythology, preserved by chance, by faith, by one friar's decision not to burn a book, that we find the story we're about to return to. A story that begins, fittingly enough, with absolutely nothing at all. And that nothing is where we have to start. Not because it's dramatic, though it is. Not because creation stories always begin with emptiness, though most of them do. But because the kind of nothing the Popol Vuh describes is different from what you might expect. It's not the nothing of other traditions, it's not a chaos waiting to be organised. It's not a battlefield of primordial forces clashing in the dark. It's something quieter than that, something that almost feels patient, if you can use that word for a state before time existed. Picture it. Or try to, since by definition there's almost nothing to picture. There is no earth, no mountains, no valleys, no forests, no rivers cutting through stone towards some distant sea that doesn't exist yet. There is no sky, no clouds, no stars, no sun, no moon turning through months that haven't been invented, because months require time and time hasn't started. There is only the sea, a vast, still, silent expanse of water stretching in every direction, or maybe in no direction at all, since directions require reference points and there are none. Above this sea, there is nothing but emptiness, an emptiness so complete that even the concept of emptiness doesn't quite capture it, because emptiness implies a container, a space where something could be but isn't. This is before containers, before space itself had been defined. And underneath the sea, the Popol Vuh is strangely quiet about that. Some translations suggest the waters covered everything, above and below indistinguishable, a totality of ocean without floor or surface. Others hint at something submerged, something resting in the depths, waiting. But the text doesn't explain. It just presents this image and moves on, as if the details don't matter yet, or as if they'll reveal themselves when the time is right, which is a kind of logic that only makes sense in a world before time. So that's the physical state, if you can call it physical when physics hasn't been invented. Water below, void above, and nothing in between. But here's where the Popol Vuh diverges from other creation myths you might know, and where the Xquic understanding of nothingness starts to feel distinct. In many traditions, the primordial state is defined by what it lacks. The Genesis narrative describes a formless void, darkness over the deep, an absence waiting to be filled. The Greek myths give us chaos, a chasm of confusion and disorder that needs shaping. Even the Norse begin with Ginnungagap, a yawning gap between fire and ice, tensions already built into the emptiness, conflict embedded in the structure of nothingness itself. The Popol Vuh doesn't do this. The nothingness it describes isn't defined by absence. It's defined by potential. The sea isn't chaotic, it's calm. The void isn't confused, it's simply empty, holding space for what will come rather than fighting against it. There's no tension here, no forces straining against each other, waiting to explode into creation through conflict or violence. Instead, there's a kind of stillness that feels almost intentional, as if the emptiness knows it will be filled, as if the silence knows it will be broken. Not through struggle, but through something else entirely. And maybe that's the most important detail in this whole section, the one that changes how you read everything that follows. Because in the Xquic cosmology, creation doesn't happen through combat. It doesn't happen through a god slaying a dragon and building the world from its body, which is a pattern you see in Babylonian myth, in Norse myth, in dozens of others. Creation in the Popol Vuh happens through conversation, through deliberation, through beings sitting together, in a void that has no chairs and no ground to put chairs on, and deciding collectively that something should exist, which means those beings must already be there, even in the nothing. Even before time, before sky, before earth, before the world has any features at all, the gods exist, or perhaps more accurately they persist. They are present in the void, not created by it, not emerging from it, but inhabiting it, in whatever way beings can inhabit a space that has no dimensions yet. The Popol Vuh names them, though the names feel strange and distant to modern ears, fragments of a language that most of us will never speak. The text refers to them collectively as Tipu and Kumats, titles that carry meanings far richer than simple names. Tipu relates to sovereignty, to the holding of power, to the capacity to command and shape. Kukumats carries the weight of something feathered, something serpentine, a force that moves between realms, that connects what is above to what is below. Later translations and commentaries sometimes render these as heart of sky and heart of earth, though those phrases are themselves interpretations, attempts to give English readers a foothold in concepts that don't translate neatly. What matters is that they are there, present, awake, aware, existing in a world that doesn't exist yet, which is a paradox the Popol Vuh doesn't try to resolve. It simply states it as fact. The gods were there, the void was there, and nothing else was there. And from that combination, everything that would ever exist would eventually emerge. But not yet. For now, there is only the sea and the emptiness, and the beings who inhabit both, and a silence so total that it goes beyond quiet. This is a silence that has never heard sound, that doesn't know what sound is, that has no concept of the thing it's missing because concepts don't exist yet either. The world, if you can call it a world, is not dead. Death requires life to define it. It's not asleep. Sleep requires wakefulness to contrast it. It simply is not. And yet, within that is not, something is. The divine presence, waiting without waiting, since waiting requires time, holding the possibility of everything that will ever be, without yet being any of it. This is the primordial void of the Popol Vuh, not a battlefield, not a chaos, not a problem that needs solving, but a quiet, vast, patient emptiness, inhabited by beings who will eventually decide that the emptiness should end. And when they make that decision, when they speak together and agree that the world should exist, that's when everything changes. That's when the first act of creation begins. Not with violence, not with struggle, but with something far simpler and far stranger. Words. But that comes next. For now, stay with the void a little longer. The silence, the stillness, the sea that has no shore, and the sky that has no stars. The presence within the absence, the potential within the nothing. This is where the Popol Vuh begins. This is the ground zero of Xquic cosmology, though there is no ground and there is no zero. Only an endless, quiet, waiting water, and the ones who dwell within it, preparing to speak the world into being for the first of what will turn out to be. Not one, not two, but 3 attempts before they finally get it right. So the void holds them. The sea stretches silent beneath an emptiness that has never known light, and within this totality of not yet, something is. The beings the Popol Vuh calls Tipu and Kukumats, sovereignty and the plumed serpent, heart of earth and heart of sky. They persist in the absence not as intruders into a hostile chaos, but as residents of a quiet potential waiting without waiting, since waiting requires a future to anticipate, and the future hasn't been invented yet. And then something shifts, not violently, not with a thunderclap or a cosmic explosion, or any of the dramatic punctuation that other creation myths use to mark the moment everything changes. The Popol Vuh's transition from void to creation is quieter than that, stranger than that, more like a change in temperature than a change in landscape, more like a thought forming than a world forming, because in the Xquic cosmology, that's exactly what it is. The text introduces a third presence into the void, or perhaps clarifies a presence that was already there, already part of the divine constellation, but not yet named, not yet distinct. Heart of sky. Huracan. The name carries echoes that reach far beyond this ancient story, though the connection is easy to miss if you're not listening carefully. Huracan. The word that would eventually, centuries later, after European contact and linguistic collision, and the strange mutations that languages undergo when they meet each other, become the English word hurricane. The storm, the destructive wind that tears across the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, flattening coastlines, reshaping landscapes, reminding everyone in its path that the forces of the atmosphere are not gentle and are not small. But that's not what huracan means here. Not yet. In the primordial void, before there is an atmosphere to generate storms, before there is a coastline to flatten, heart of sky is not destruction. Heart of sky is something more fundamental, more original. The capacity for movement itself, the principle that stillness can become action, the idea that the quiet can at some point choose to stop being quiet. And there are three of them. The Popol Vuh is precise about this, though the precision can feel confusing at first. Three aspects of heart of sky: Kukula huracan, the lightning that flashes once, sudden and brief. Chipi Kukula, the lightning that flashes again, the second bolt that confirms the first was real, that the storm is not a single aberration but a pattern, a presence. Raxa Kukula, the lightning that flashes 3 times, the completion of the sequence, the signature of something systematic rather than random. 3 lightning aspects of a single divine principle. 3 expressions of the same force. 3 because 3 matters in Maya cosmology. 3 because completion often requires more than 1. 3 because even the gods speak in patterns before they speak in words. Which brings us to the central act. The moment that separates the quiche creation story from almost every other origin narrative you might encounter. Because in many traditions, creation begins with action. A god moves, a god strikes, a god builds, shapes, wrestles, kills, divides, conquers. The physical gesture comes first, and the world follows from it as a consequence of divine labour, divine violence, divine craft. The Popol Vuh doesn't do this. Creation begins with speech, with conversation, with beings talking to each other, deliberating together, arriving at a shared conclusion about what should exist, and then, only then, making it so. The text describes it plainly, without embellishment, as if the sequence is obvious, as if creation through conversation is the most natural thing in the world, which for the quiche it apparently was. Tipu and Cucumat speak. Heart of Sky speaks. They talk together. They think together. They deliberate. The Popol Vuh uses a remarkable phrase for this process, or rather, a remarkable repetition that English translations struggle to capture cleanly. They thought puzzled, they wondered, they pondered, they deliberated. The same action repeated in multiple phrasing, as if the text is trying to emphasize something that a single word couldn't convey. The gods are not simply deciding. They are working through the decision. They are puzzling over it, which implies that the answer isn't obvious, that creation requires genuine thought, that even divine beings need to figure things out rather than simply knowing them from the start. This is a staggering theological claim, if you slow down enough to feel its weight. The gods of the Popol Vuh are not omniscient. They don't possess a complete blueprint of reality that they simply execute like cosmic architects following a finished design. They think, they wonder, they puzzle. Creation, for them, is not the implementation of a pre-existing plan. It's the discovery of one, a collaborative discovery, arrived at through dialogue, through the exchange of ideas between distinct beings who each contribute something to the conversation that the others might not have thought of alone. And the content of that conversation? The Popol Vuh tells us directly. They said to each other, they spoke, they joined their words, they united their thoughts. And then, emerging from that union of speech and thought, came the decision, the dawn of creation, the moment the potential within the void becomes actual, the moment the not yet crosses the threshold into now. But here's the crucial detail, the one that makes the quiche cosmology feel so different from so many others. The gods aren't creating the world for themselves. They already exist. They already inhabit the void. They have no need of mountains, rivers, forests, animals, or any of the features that will eventually populate the created world. They are creating it for someone else, someone who doesn't exist yet. Someone who, in a very specific way, is the purpose of the entire conversation. They want to create beings who can speak their names, beings who can acknowledge them, remember them, sustain them through recognition and prayer. The Popol Vuh states this motivation with startling clarity, though it can feel jarring to modern readers who expect cosmic creation to be driven by something more abstract, more impersonal, more grandly philosophical. The gods want to be named, they want to be known, they want relationship, not with each other since they already have that, but with something new, something outside themselves, something that can witness their existence and respond to it. This is why speech matters so much in the Popol Vuh, why the act of creation is an act of conversation, why the gods think and talk before they act. Because the whole point of creation is speech. The gods speak the world into being so that beings can exist who will speak back. The cycle of naming and being named, of calling and responding, of prayer and acknowledgement, this is what the created world is for. Not as a stage for divine drama, not as a battlefield for cosmic conflict, as a space for relationship, for the mutual recognition that only speech makes possible. And the symbolism deepens when you look at the elements the text associates with this process. Water, which was already there, the primordial sea that held the gods before it held anything else. Wind, which heart of sky represents the capacity for movement, for breath, for the physical force that carries sound from one being to another. And word, the speech itself, the conversation that transforms potential into reality. 3 elements, 3 principles, water, wind, and word. 3 again, because 3 matters, because the pattern repeats itself at every scale of the story, from the lightning aspects of Heart of Sky, to the elemental forces of creation, to the attempts at humanity that will follow. The sea provides the medium, the substance from which things can be made. The wind provides the energy, the breath that animates, the force that pushes form into being. And the word provides the direction, the intention, the plan that emerges from deliberation and gives the other 2 forces a target, a purpose, a shape to move toward. Together, they're ready now, the council has concluded. The gods have spoken, have thought, have puzzled, have arrived at their decision. They will create, not because they must, not because some external force compels them, not because the void is unbearable or incomplete or wrong, but because they have chosen to, because they want beings who will speak their names. Because they want relationship with something that doesn't exist yet, and they have the power to make it exist. And so the first creation begins, not with a bang, not with a gesture, not with a god reaching into the void and pulling matter out of nothing by sheer force of will, but with words spoken between beings who thought and puzzled and wondered until they agreed on what should come next, and then, together, spoke it into being. And so it begins not with hands shaping clay, not with a god descending into the void to carve mountains from nothing, but with the continuation of that same conversation, that same deliberation that had brought the gods to the threshold of action. They had agreed on what they wanted, beings who would speak their names. Now they had to build the place where those beings would stand. The Popol Vuh describes this first act of creation with the same strange simplicity it used for the divine council. They spoke earth, and the earth arose. That's the sequence. Speech, then existence. Word, then world, no intermediate step. No period of gestation or gradual formation. The gods say the word and the thing is there, as if reality has been waiting all this time, suspended in the void, just needing someone to name it so it could finally be real. Which raises a question that the text doesn't answer directly, but that hovers in the margins of the story like a shadow you can't quite see clearly. Where was the earth before the gods spoke it? Was it hidden somewhere within the primordial sea, lying dormant, waiting to be called forth? Or did it truly not exist? Was there genuinely nothing there until language reached into the absolute void and pulled the world into being? The Popol Vuh does not tell us. It simply says that the word was spoken and the earth arose. That ambiguity may be important. It may point toward a worldview in which reality is not created from nothing, so much as transformed from potential into actuality. The earth is not manufactured. It is spoken, summoned, acknowledged into existence from a state in which it may always have been present, but had never yet been expressed. And then the earth came, not as something smooth and unfinished, waiting to be shaped later, but already whole, already divided, already filled with the fundamental features it would continue to possess. Mountains rose from the sea, but they were not assembled stone by stone. They were spoken into existence together with their peaks and ridges, their high slopes and deep valleys. It is as though all those features were already contained within the word itself, as though it were impossible to say mountain without also calling forth its particular shape, as though language carried every detail of the thing it described and needed only to be spoken aloud to release it. The text lingers over this unfolding landscape. Mountains appear, and between the mountains come valleys and plains. Across those plains, streams begin to run. Water comes because water was already there. It was the primordial element, the first medium, the substance in which the gods had dwelled even while the world remained a void. Now it separates itself from that vast and undifferentiated sea and assumes a new form, moving water, flowing water, water travelling through a particular landscape, following particular paths toward destinations that seem to have been spoken into existence alongside the rivers themselves. Then come the trees, then the forests. The world of plants emerges from the words for earth and water, just as the landscape emerged from the word for the earth itself. Cypresses and pines rise together, vines and thickets spread across the new ground. Everything is named, distinguished, and confirmed. That attention to detail is not accidental. It is a declaration that creation is not vague or abstract. It is specific, it is local. The Xquic knew their mountains. They knew their rivers, they knew which trees grew at which elevations and which creatures belonged in each part of the landscape. When their sacred narrative describes the gods creating mountains, valleys, streams, and forests, it is speaking about the recognizable world around them. These were not anonymous features in some distant mythical country. They were the mountains and valleys their people could see, direct products of sacred speech. Within the logic of the story, they did not arise through the slow collision of stone over unimaginable spans of time. They appeared complete when the gods spoke the world into being. The earth was finished. The plants were finished. The landscape had answered the divine words and risen out of the void, filled with form and difference, filled with its own internal order and structure. But something was still missing. No one inhabited these spaces. No one moved beneath the trees, drank from the streams, or stood upon the mountains and understood that they were there. So the gods spoke again, animals, deer and birds, jaguars and serpents. Guardians and watchers, as the text describes them. Each creature was assigned a dwelling, a home, a place within the landscape that belonged to it. The deer received the plains and the edges of the forest. The birds received the open sky and the branches of the trees. The jaguars received the thickets and the shadows of the mountains. The serpents received the cracks in the earth and the hidden places beneath it. Once again, the arrangement was specific. The gods did not simply create animals as one undivided category. Particular creatures were joined to particular places. The new world was becoming an order, a structure, a living landscape in which everything had been spoken into its proper position. And that order had a purpose. The gods were not merely filling an empty landscape because emptiness displeased them. They were preparing it for what would come next. They were constructing a complete and functioning world, a world crowded with life, yet still waiting for its centre. It was waiting for the creature that would give creation a reason, acknowledge its makers, and speak the names of the gods. The animals were therefore given a purpose of their own, a responsibility. Call our names, the gods told the living creatures. Praise us, remember us. You have been spoken, you have been created. Now you must speak in return, you must answer, you must complete the circle of the conversation that brought you into existence. We are the ones whose words made you real. You are meant to become the ones whose words make us known. That was the exchange, that was the arrangement. It was the logic behind the entire act of creation, reaching all the way back to that first divine council, when the gods were still thinking, still questioning, and still deciding what should come next. But the tension was already there. At the very moment of this first creation, just after the gods had spoken the earth, mountains, rivers, trees, and animals into existence, and before they knew whether their work had succeeded, the Popol Vuh introduces a quiet warning. It is almost imperceptible at first. A pause, a question left unspoken, but built into the structure of the story. The gods wanted creatures capable of speech. They wanted beings that could pronounce their names. They created the animals and commanded them to speak. But could the animals do that? Did they possess the voice, the mind, and the understanding needed to reproduce the kind of language that had brought them into existence? Could they name? Could they remember? Could they acknowledge the beings responsible for their creation? The text does not answer immediately. It makes us wait. It leaves the animals standing in their newly created world, among their forests and plains, beside their mountains and rivers. They have been told to speak, told to praise, told to remember, but we have not yet discovered whether they can do any of those things. That uncertainty, the distance between creation and purpose, the silence between a divine word and its hoped-for response will become one of the ideas running through the entire Popol Vuh. The gods can speak and cause a world to appear, but can that world speak back? The answer will determine everything, and so we come to the moment that everything hinges on. The moment the gods have been waiting for since that first conversation in the void. The earth is built, the mountains stand, the waters flow, the forests grow, the animals have been placed in their designated spaces, each species assigned its territory, its role, its purpose. And that purpose, the only purpose that matters, the reason the whole enterprise was undertaken in the first place, is simple. Speak our names, praise us, remember us, acknowledge that we made you, that we spoke you into being, that you exist because of our words, and that your words should now circle back to us, completing the circuit, closing the loop, making the creation whole. The gods wait. They listen. The entire newly made world holds its breath. And the animals open their mouths. What comes out is not what the gods wanted. Not what they needed. Not what they had imagined when they first conceived the idea of beings who would speak their names. The deer makes a sound, but it is not a word. It is a grunt, a low vocalization that carries across the plains but carries no meaning. The bird opens its beak and produces something, a chirp, a trill, a series of notes that might be beautiful in their own way, that might even be a kind of music, but that contains no language, no recognition, no awareness of who made the bird or why it was made or what it was supposed to do. The jaguar growls, the snake hisses, the parrot squawks. Each creature produces its own sound, its own call, its own way of expressing whatever it expresses, but none of them produce speech. None of them form words. None of them say the names of the gods. None of them pray. The Popol Vuh describes this moment with a kind of devastating simplicity. They could not speak. They could only cry and chatter. They could only make noise, and the text gives us those noises, those sounds, that failed attempt at language. Squawk, chatter, howl, shriek, each one a kind of vocalization, each one an effort to produce something from the throat and the mouth and the tongue, but each one falling short of what language actually requires. Because language is not just sound, language is not just the movement of air through a vocal tract. Language is meaning, language is intention, language is the capacity to take a thought, an idea, a recognition, a memory, and encode it into sounds that another being can decode and understand. Language is a bridge between minds, and the animals did not have that bridge. They had the materials for it, perhaps. They had voices. They had mouths. They had the physical apparatus to produce sounds. But they lacked something else, something internal, something that connected the sound to the thought, the vocalization to the intention, the cry to the prayer. You can imagine the gods listening to this chorus of animal sounds, this cacophony of shrieks and growls and hisses and chatters, and realizing what had happened. They had created beings with voices, but without the capacity to use those voices for the purpose they were created for. They had made instruments that could produce sound, but could not produce meaning. They had built mouths that could open and close, but could not form words. And the implications of this failure were enormous. Not just because the gods wanted praise, though they did. Not just because they wanted recognition, though they did. But because the entire logic of creation depended on this reciprocal relationship. The gods speak, the world exists, the world speaks, the gods are known. Without that second half of the equation, without that response, without that acknowledgement, the creation remains incomplete. It is like writing a letter and never receiving a reply, like asking a question and hearing only silence, like building a house and no one ever living in it. The structure exists, but it has no purpose. The form is there, but the meaning is missing. And so the gods confront their first real setback, their first failure. They had succeeded in making a world. They had succeeded in filling that world with geography and water and plants and animals. But they had failed in making that world do what it was supposed to do. They had failed in creating beings who could complete the circuit of creation by acknowledging their creators. The animals were alive, but they were not aware. They existed, but they did not recognize that they existed because of the gods. They had voices, but they did not have language. And without language, without the ability to speak names and offer prayers and express gratitude, they could not fulfill their purpose. They were, in a sense, beautiful failures, living proof that creation without recognition is incomplete. That existence without awareness is not enough. That a world full of beings who do not know why they are here is a world that has not yet achieved what it was made for. The text tells us what happened next, and it is one of the most revealing passages in the entire Popol Vuh. The gods do not simply abandon the animals, they do not destroy them. They do not erase them from the world they have just built. Instead, they reassign them. They change the terms of the arrangement. The animals will continue to exist, but they will exist in a different relationship to the beings who come after. Their purpose will not be to speak the names of the gods. Their purpose will be to serve, to be hunted, to be eaten, to provide their flesh and their blood and their bones to whatever new creation the gods attempt next. This is not a punishment exactly, it is a restructuring. A recognition that what was made for one purpose can be repurposed for another when the first purpose fails. The deer that could not prey will now be food for the being that can. The bird that could not praise will now give its feathers and its meat to the creature that will offer the praise the gods require. The jaguar that could not remember will become the challenge, the danger, the test that the new beings must overcome in order to prove their worth. The animals are not discarded. They are incorporated into a new plan, a new design, a new attempt to create something that will do what the animals could not. But there is something else in this passage, something that resonates beyond the immediate narrative and touches on ideas that feel surprisingly modern, surprisingly relevant to questions we still ask about consciousness and language and what it means to be a being that can recognize its own existence. The Popol Vuh is telling us, in its own ancient and mythological way, that there is a difference between being alive and being aware. That there is a gap between having a voice and having language. That existence without recognition, without the capacity to acknowledge the source of your existence, is a kind of incompleteness. And this idea, this distinction between mere life and meaningful life, between vocalization and speech, between being and knowing, will echo through every subsequent creation attempt in the story. The mud people will fail for similar reasons, though their failure will be different in kind. The wood people will fail in a way that looks like success for a time, but that ultimately reveals the same fundamental problem. Beings who do not recognize their creators, beings who do not fulfill the purpose for which they were made, beings who exist but do not understand why they exist or what they owe to the forces that brought them into being. This first failure with the animals establishes the pattern. It sets the terms. It defines what the gods are looking for and what they will accept and what they will reject. And it raises a question that will hover over the rest of the story like a shadow. What kind of being can do what the animals could not? What kind of creature can take the gift of voice and transform it into the gift of language? What kind of mind can look at the world it inhabits and recognize that world as a creation, as something made by beings who spoke it into existence, as something that demands a response, a recognition, a word spoken back in the direction of the words that first spoke it forward? The gods do not answer this question yet. They do not know the answer yet. They have only learned what does not work. They have only discovered that giving voice without giving understanding, giving sound without giving meaning, giving life without giving awareness, produces beings that cannot complete the circuit of creation. They have learned that the capacity to speak is not the same as the capacity to pray, and now they must try again. They must attempt something new, something different, something that might bridge the gap between voice and language, between existence and recognition, between being alive and being aware. They must create a being that can do what the animals could not. And this next attempt, this second try, will take them deeper into the problem of creation than they have gone before. It will force them to consider not just what they want their creations to do, but what those creations must be in order to do it. Not just what function they should fulfill, but what nature they must possess in order to fulfill that function. The animals had voices but no understanding. The next creation would need both. And the question was whether the gods could make such a thing. Whether they could create a being that could not only speak but speak with intention. Not only make sounds but make meaning. Not only exist in the world but recognize the world as a creation and acknowledge its creators by name. The gods turn to this new attempt with the knowledge of their first failure behind them. The animals cry and chatter and howl in the forests and plains, filling the world with sound but not with speech. And somewhere in the divine council, the conversation begins again. What went wrong? What must be different? How to make a creature that can do what the deer and the bird and the jaguar could not? How to make something that can pray? So the gods return to their work. They return to the fundamental problem that the animals could not solve, the problem of speech, of recognition, of a creature that can look at the world around it and understand that world as something made, something spoken into being, something that demands a response. And this time they try a different approach, a different material, a different strategy. They turn to the earth itself, the wet clay, the mud that lies along the river banks and in the low places where water pools after rain, the substance that is most intimately connected to the ground they have just built, the substance that seems perhaps to carry within it the memory of creation, the imprint of the words that spoke the mountains and the valleys into existence. If the animals were made and placed in their territories without success, perhaps a being shaped from the very fabric of the earth itself, a being made from the same material as the ground it walks on, might have a deeper connection to the act of creation, might feel in its very bones, in the clay of its flesh, that it is not just living on the world, but is made from the world, is part of the world, is the world given form and consciousness. This is the logic behind the second creation. This is the hope that drives the gods as they reach down into the mud and begin to shape. The Popol Vuh describes this process with a kind of careful attention that suggests both the gods' investment in the attempt and their uncertainty about whether it will work. They take the wet earth, they take the clay, they mix it, they mould it, they shape it into something that looks like a human being, something that has a head and a body and arms and legs, something that stands upright and faces the sky, the way the gods face the sky, the way a being made to pray must face the direction of its creators. And for a moment perhaps it seems promising. The mud takes shape. The clay holds together. The figure stands, or at least attempts to stand, on the ground that is its mother and its substance and its home. The gods give this being the gift of speech, the same gift they gave to the animals, the capacity to produce sound from the throat and the mouth and the tongue, the physical ability to push air through a vocal tract and turn that air into vibrations that can be heard by other beings. And the mudman speaks, or rather, the mudman attempts to speak. The mudman produces something from its mouth that is closer to language than what the animals achieved. Something that sounds like words, that has the rhythm and the cadence of words, that seems to be reaching toward the possibility of meaning, toward the possibility of recognition, toward the possibility of completing the circuit that the animals left broken. But there is a problem. There is a fundamental flaw in this creation that becomes visible almost immediately, that manifests itself in the very substance of the being, in the material from which it was made. The mudman has no strength, not in the sense of physical power, not in the sense of the ability to fight or hunt or lift heavy objects, though it lacks those things too, but in a deeper sense, in the sense of structure, of coherence, of the capacity to hold itself together as a unified and stable form. The mud that the gods used to shape this creature is wet. It is damp, it is saturated with water, and water, while it is essential to life, while it is one of the fundamental elements of creation, while it flows through rivers and fills oceans and sustains every living thing on the surface of the earth, does not hold shape on its own. Water flows, water moves, water seeks the lowest point and spreads and disperses, and finds every crack and crevice and pathway that will carry it away from any structure that attempts to contain it. Clay mixed with too much water does not solidify. It does not set. It does not become hard and firm and durable. It remains soft. It remains pliable. It remains, in a sense, always on the verge of dissolution, always on the edge of collapsing back into the puddle from which it was raised. And this is exactly what happens to the mud people. The Popol Vuh describes their bodies with a kind of visceral precision that makes the failure tangible, that makes you feel the instability of this creation in your own body, that makes you imagine what it would be like to walk through the world knowing that your legs might soften beneath you, that your arms might droop and stretch like wet cloth, that your face might blur and sag and lose its definition as the water in your flesh slowly pulls you back toward the ground from which you were made. Their bodies were soft. Their heads could not turn properly. Their faces could only look in one direction. Their arms could not reach. Their legs could not support them with any certainty. When they tried to walk, they wobbled. When they tried to stand, they swayed. When they tried to speak, their mouths opened and closed, but the sounds that came out were unclear, were muffled, were half-formed, were the vocalizations of a being whose tongue was too wet to articulate properly, whose lips were too soft to shape the precise movements that language requires. You can picture this creature. You can imagine it standing beside a river, the same river whose mud gave it life, and you can see the water already beginning to bead on its surface, the moisture already beginning to seep and drip and run in small rivulets down its arms and its torso and its legs. You can see the sun hitting its body and accelerating the process, warming the wet clay, making it softer, making it more vulnerable to the very elements that should be sustaining it. You can see the mudman attempting to raise its arms in prayer, attempting to lift its hands toward the sky in the gesture of recognition that the gods so desperately want, and you can see those arms failing to hold the position, dropping back down, not in refusal, not in rebellion, but in simple physical inability. The arms are too heavy, the clay is too wet, the structure cannot support the gesture. The being cannot complete the motion. It wants to pray, perhaps. It has been given the capacity to want, or at least the shadow of that capacity, the echo of desire, the dim awareness that there is something above it, something that made it, something that it should acknowledge. But wanting is not enough. Desire is not enough. Even the intention to pray is not enough if the body cannot carry out the intention, if the physical form cannot execute the gesture, if the substance of the creature undermines the purpose for which it was created. The symbolism here is rich and layered, and it touches on something that the Maya understood deeply, something that shaped their entire relationship with the earth and with creation and with the cycles of life and death and transformation that governed their world. Earth is nurturing, earth is the source of life, earth is the ground from which crops grow, the soil that receives seeds and transforms them into food, the substance that sustains human communities and makes agriculture possible. But earth is also unstable. Earth erodes. Earth washes away in floods. Earth cracks and splits in droughts. Earth shifts and slides and settles and subsides. The same substance that gives life can also take it away. The same ground that supports you can also swallow you. The same soil that feeds you can also, when the conditions change, when the water rises, when the balance tips, dissolve the very structures you have built upon it, and carry them away in a river of mud and debris. This duality, this tension between nurturing and unstable, between life-giving and life-taking, between the earth that supports and the earth that dissolves, is written into the very fabric of the mud people. They are earth given consciousness. They are clay given the gift of speech. They are the nurturing aspect of the ground made into a living form. But they are also, inevitably, inescapably, the unstable aspect of that same ground. They carry within their bodies the very quality that makes earth unreliable. The wetness, the softness, the tendency to flow rather than hold, the tendency to dissolve rather than endure, The gods watch this creation with what the text suggests is a kind of cautious optimism, a kind of guarded hope, a kind of willingness to see the potential even as the flaws become impossible to ignore. The mud people can speak, after all, or they can attempt to speak. They can produce something from their mouths that sounds like language, that approaches the threshold of meaning, that gets closer to the goal than the animals ever did. They can stand, however unsteadily, they can move, however imperfectly. They can look toward the sky, however briefly, however uncertainly, with eyes that are still forming, with faces that are still holding their shape, with bodies that are still, for this moment, for this hour, for this particular stretch of time before the water wins, maintaining the form that the gods gave them. There is something here, something that might work, something that with adjustment, with refinement, with a different approach to the same basic material, might achieve what the animals could not. The gods do not give up on the mud people immediately. They do not dissolve them at the first sign of trouble. They watch, they wait, they see what happens when the wet clay meets the dry air, when the damp body meets the warm sun, when the unstable form meets the demands of a world that requires stability, that requires durability, that requires durability, that requires beings who can stand without swaying and speak without mumbling and pray without their arms dropping back to their sides in physical defeat. But the signs are already there, the early signs that this creation, like the first one, will not succeed. The mud is too wet. The structure is too soft. The form is too fragile. The being wants to pray but cannot complete the gesture. The being wants to speak but cannot form the words. The being wants to acknowledge its creators but cannot hold itself together long enough to do so with any clarity or conviction. The circuit remains broken. The loop remains open. The creation remains incomplete. And somewhere in the divine council, the conversation begins again. What went wrong? What must be different? How to make a creature that can do what the animals could not, and what the mud people cannot quite manage? How to make something that can pray? How to make something that can endure long enough to pray? How to make something whose substance matches, whose purpose, whose form matches, whose function, whose body can carry out, whose intention? The mud people stand beside their rivers, slowly dissolving, slowly drooping, slowly losing the shape that was given to them, and the gods watch and learn and prepare for another attempt. And so the dissolution begins, not as a sudden catastrophe, not as a dramatic undoing, but as a slow, relentless process that unfolds in the very substance of these beings, in the wet clay that constitutes their flesh and their bone and their everything. The mud people do not fall. They do not collapse in a single dramatic moment. They melt. They soften. They gradually, inexorably, lose the definition that the gods so carefully impressed upon them when they reached down into the river banks and shaped the wet earth into something that looked, for a brief and hopeful interval, like a human form. The Popol Vuh describes this dissolution with a kind of quiet inevitability that makes it feel less like a punishment and more like a natural process, less like a divine judgment, and more like the simple working out of physical laws that the gods themselves set in motion when they chose this material. Water seeks equilibrium. Wet clay seeks the ground. A form made from mud and moisture cannot maintain itself indefinitely against the forces that pull it back toward its original state, toward the puddle, toward the riverbank, toward the undifferentiated earth from which it was temporarily lifted and shaped. You can imagine what this looked like. You can picture the mudman standing in the early morning, the cool air preserving some of its structure, the dew on its surface blending seamlessly with the moisture already present in its clay flesh, and for a moment, in that cool and damp hour before the sun rises high, the creature almost works. Its legs hold, its arms maintain their position, its face retains the features that were pressed into it by divine hands. It looks like a person, It looks like something that might succeed. It looks like the answer to the problem that has been troubling the gods since the animals failed to speak. But then the sun climbs higher, the temperature rises. The warmth reaches the mudman's body and begins to do what warmth always does to wet clay. It accelerates the evaporation of the surface moisture, but it also softens the interior structure, makes the clay more pliable, more vulnerable to deformation, less able to resist the pull of gravity and the tendency of water to flow downward. The mudman's skin begins to glisten, not with sweat, not with the healthy moisture of a living creature, but with the water that is already separating from the clay, already beginning to bead and drip and run in small channels down the surface of the body. First, the hands lose their definition, the careful articulation of fingers, the precise shaping of palms, the delicate moulding of knuckles and joints. All of this begins to blur. The fingers soften into one continuous mass of wet clay. The palms flatten and spread. The hands become less like hands and more like paddles, more like undifferentiated lumps of mud hanging from the ends of arms that are themselves beginning to stretch and droop under the weight of their own moisture. Then the face. The face is the most carefully shaped part of the mud man, the part that required the most attention and skill from the gods, the part that was meant to express recognition and understanding and the capacity for prayer. The eyes, which were given the ability to see, begin to lose their shape. The sockets widen and soften. The lips, which were given the ability to speak, begin to blur together, losing the sharp definition that language requires, becoming a continuous smear of wet clay, where mouth and chin and jaw used to be distinguishable features. The nose flattens, the cheeks sag. The entire structure of the face begins to slide downward, pulled by gravity, pulled by water, pulled by the fundamental instability of a form that was never meant to hold. And then the speech. The speech is perhaps the most revealing aspect of this failure, the clearest indicator that something essential is missing from this creation, something that cannot be added through better moulding or more careful shaping or divine attention to detail. The mud people can produce sounds, their throats can vibrate, their mouths can open and close, but the sounds that emerge are not words, they are not language, they are something that the Popol Vuh describes with a kind of precise contempt, a kind of dismissive clarity that leaves no room for interpretation. The mud people mumble, they mumble, not speak, not pray, not articulate, mumble. What does mumbling mean in this context? It means that the physical apparatus of speech is present, but the control over that apparatus is absent. It means that the throat can produce vibration, but the tongue cannot shape that vibration into consonants. The lips cannot form that vibration into vowels. The mouth cannot transform that vibration into the precise and deliberate sounds that constitute language. It means that there is noise, but not meaning. There is sound, but not communication. There is the mechanical process of speech, but not the intentional act of speaking. The mud people make noise the way a river makes noise, the way rain makes noise, the way any natural process that involves the movement of fluid makes noise. Their speech is not a conscious act, it is a byproduct of their physical structure. It is what happens when wet clay attempts to vibrate and push air through a channel that was shaped for that purpose, but cannot control the process with the precision that purpose requires. And then the rain comes, or perhaps it does not come immediately. Perhaps there is a period of dry weather during which the mud people simply soften and sag, and lose their form under the influence of the sun and the air and their own inherent instability. But eventually, in the narrative of the Popol Vuh, the water returns. The water that was used to create these beings, the water that was mixed with the clay to make it pliable and workable, the water that gave the mud its moisture and its capacity to be shaped, that same water returns in a different form, rain falling from the sky, coming from the clouds, returning to the earth from which it was temporarily lifted and held, and incorporated into the bodies of these fragile creatures. And the rain does what rain does to mud. It dissolves it. It washes it away. It breaks down the already weakened structure of the mud people and carries the clay back to the ground, back to the riverbanks, back to the low places where water pools and mud collects, and the cycle of wet earth begins again. The mudman stands in the rain, and the rain hits its body and the body begins to flow. Not in pieces, not in chunks, but in a continuous and unstoppable process of dissolution. The surface clay softens and runs. The interior structure loses its cohesion and begins to separate. The entire creature, from head to foot, from face to hands to legs, begins to return to the state from which it was made. Wet earth, mud, nothing more, nothing less. The shape that was imposed upon it by divine hands is erased. The form that was carefully crafted in a moment of hope and effort is undone. The being that was given speech and the capacity for prayer is reduced to the substance from which it was raised, and that substance cannot speak, cannot pray, cannot recognize its creators, cannot complete the circuit that the gods so desperately want to close. The gods watch this happen. They watch their second creation dissolve in the rain, dissolve in the sun, dissolve in its own inherent instability, dissolve in the fundamental contradiction between its purpose and its substance. They watch the mud people attempt to speak and produce only mumbling. They watch the mud people attempt to pray and fail to hold their arms in the position of recognition. They watch the mud people attempt to stand and wobble and sway and eventually lose the ability to stand at all, as their legs soften and spread and merge with the ground beneath them. And they learn, or rather they confirm what they already suspected, what they perhaps knew from the beginning but chose to test anyway, chose to attempt anyway, chose to pursue with the same stubborn hope that drives all creation, the hope that this time it might work, that this time the material might match the purpose, that this time the form might sustain the function. Mud cannot hold life. Wet clay cannot sustain consciousness. Earth that is too wet, too soft, too unstable, too prone to dissolution and flow cannot provide the foundation for a being whose purpose is to endure, to speak, to recognize, to pray. The material is wrong, not the concept, not the intention. Not the design, the material, the substance, the very fabric of the creature. The symbolism of this failure resonates through Maya, thought in ways that extend far beyond this single narrative. Impermanence, formlessness, the inability to hold shape, to maintain structure, to persist through time and weather and circumstance. These are not just physical problems, they are existential problems. They are the problems that define the boundary between a creature that can participate in the world and a creature that is merely washed through the world, that passes through experience without retaining it, that encounters reality without engaging with it, that exists for a time but never truly lives, because living requires persistence, requires continuity, requires the ability to remember and to intend and to follow through on an intention from one moment to the next. The mud people cannot do this. They cannot persist. They cannot remember. They cannot intend. They cannot follow through. Their existence is a continuous process of losing themselves, of shedding form, of drifting back toward the undifferentiated state from which they were raised. They are not beings, they are processes. They are temporary configurations of wet clay that happen to look like beings for a brief interval before the water and the sun and the rain and their own inherent instability reduce them back to the substance from which they were made. And the gods understand this. They understand it not as a failure of their skill or their power or their intention, but as a failure of the material itself, as a revelation about the nature of mud and wet clay and what these substances can and cannot support. Mud can support growth, mud can support roots, mud can support the slow and patient processes of vegetation, the gradual extension of stems and leaves and flowers that do not need to hold a specific shape independently, but can rely on the water and nutrients flowing through them from the ground below. But mud cannot support a being that must hold its own shape. Mud cannot support a creature that must stand on its own legs. Mud cannot support a life that must speak its own words and remember its own experiences and pray its own prayers without the constant assistance of the substance from which it was made. This is the lesson of the second creation. This is what the gods take from the dissolution of the mud people. The material must be different, not just better mud, not just drier clay, not just more careful mixing and moulding and shaping. A different material entirely, something that can hold form without dissolving, something that can support speech without mumbling, something that can endure long enough to pray, long enough to recognize, long enough to complete the circuit that the gods are trying to close between creator and created, between the ones who speak the world into being and the ones who are meant to speak back. The Divine Council convenes again. The conversation resumes. The problem is the same. The solution must be different. The animals could not speak. The mud people could not hold. What material, what substance, what fundamental fabric of the created world might provide both the capacity for language and the stability of form? What might sustain both consciousness and durability? What might give a being the ability to pray and the ability to survive long enough to pray? The gods consider the options. They consider the materials available in the world they have made. They consider the elements and substances and fabrics that might serve as the foundation for a third attempt. And slowly, carefully, with the caution that comes from two failures and the determination that comes from a purpose that cannot be abandoned, they begin to formulate a new approach, a different strategy, a third creation, wood. The gods turn to wood. After the instability of mud, after the formlessness of wet clay that could not hold its shape against water and sun and gravity, they choose a material that possesses exactly the quality that the previous creation lacked. Rigidity, structure, the capacity to maintain form independent of the conditions around it. A tree does not dissolve in the rain. A branch does not sag under the sun. A piece of carved timber does not slowly flow back toward the ground from which it grew. Wood holds, wood endures, wood remembers the shape that was given to it and retains that shape through heat and cold, through wet and dry, through the ordinary variations of weather and time that destroyed the mud people so completely and so rapidly. This is the logic of the third creation, and it is a logic born directly from the failure of the second. The gods have learned that the material must be able to persist, must be able to maintain its structure without constant divine intervention, must be able to stand on its own legs without wobbling and softening and flowing back toward the substance from which it was raised. Wood meets this requirement. Wood is strong. Wood is stable. Wood can be carved into precise shapes that retain their definition over time. Fingers that are carved into wood remain fingers. Faces that are carved into wood retain their features. Mouths that are carved into wood maintain the sharp edges and clear boundaries that language requires. The Divine Council approaches this third attempt with a kind of cautious optimism that is different from the desperate hope that drove the second creation. They are not improvising anymore. They are not grasping at whatever material seems convenient or available. They are making a deliberate choice based on what they have observed, based on what they have learned from two failures, based on a careful analysis of what went wrong and what might be done differently. And wood seems like the right choice. It seems like the material that might finally bridge the gap between the god's intention and the physical reality of the created world. So they begin to carve. The Popol Vuh describes this process with a kind of restrained simplicity that conceals what must have been an enormous effort, an enormous investment of divine attention and skill. They carve beings out of wood, they shape them into the form of humans. They give them bodies with legs that can walk, and arms that can work, and heads that can hold faces with eyes and mouths and noses. They carve them carefully, precisely, with the attention to detail that comes from experience, from the knowledge that every feature matters, that every shape serves a function, that the articulation of fingers and the definition of lips and the placement of eyes are not just aesthetic choices, but practical requirements for a being that must interact with the world and speak to its creators. And the wood people work, or at least they appear to work. They do what the mud people could not do. They stand. They hold their shape. They walk on their wooden legs without wobbling or softening or dissolving. They move through the world with a kind of mechanical efficiency that must have seemed like progress to the gods, like evidence that this third attempt might succeed where the previous two had failed. They talk. Their wooden mouths can open and close. Their wooden throats can produce vibration. Their wooden tongues, carved with precision, can shape that vibration into something that resembles language. Not the mumbling of the mud people, not the fluid and uncontrollable noise that wet clay produced when it attempted to speak, but something more deliberate, more structured, more recognizable as an attempt at communication. They multiply. The Popol Vuh notes this capacity with what feels like approval, with the kind of satisfaction that comes from seeing a creation fulfill at least one of its intended functions. The wood people reproduce. They populate the earth. They spread across the surface of the world that the gods have made, filling the mountains and the valleys and the forests with their wooden presence, establishing communities and families and the basic structures of social organization that the gods had hoped to see in their creations. They build houses, they make tools, or at least they make things that resemble tools. They establish the rudiments of what looks like civilization, what looks like the kind of organized and purposeful existence that distinguishes a true creation from a mere configuration of matter. For a time, it must have seemed like the answer had finally been found. The animals could not speak, but the wood people could produce sounds that approached language. The mud people could not hold their form, but the wood people maintained their shape through every condition and every challenge. The problem of creation appeared to be solved, or at least partially solved, or at least addressed in a way that seemed like progress, that seemed like movement toward the goal that the gods had been pursuing since they first looked at the empty surface of the earth and felt the absence of beings who could recognize them and speak their names and offer the prayers that would complete the circuit between creator and created. But there were signs, subtle signs, signs that the gods might have noticed if they were paying close attention, or signs that they might have chosen to ignore in their optimism, in their hope that this creation would succeed, in their reluctance to confront the possibility that the fundamental problem might not be solvable through material selection alone. The wood people walked, but their walking had a quality that was difficult to name, a stiffness, a regularity, a kind of rhythmic predictability that seemed more mechanical than intentional. They moved the way a machine moves, the way a wind-up toy walks when the spring is wound, and the gears are engaged with a precision that is impressive but somehow empty, somehow lacking the variation and spontaneity that characterize truly purposeful movement. They talked, but their talking had a similar quality. Their speech was structured. It was recognizable. It was better than mumbling. But it lacked something that is difficult to define but essential to true language: flexibility, creativity, the capacity to say something new, something unexpected, something that emerges from genuine thought rather than from the mechanical operation of a carved tongue and a hollow throat. They reproduced, but their reproduction was prolific in a way that seemed almost excessive, almost uncontrolled, as if the capacity to multiply had been given without the corresponding capacity to regulate, to limit, to choose when and where and how new beings should be brought into existence. And beneath all of these observable signs, beneath the stiffness of their movement and the flatness of their speech and the uncontrolled proliferation of their numbers, there was something deeper, something that the Popol Vuh identifies with a precision that cuts through all of the surface observations and reaches the heart of the problem. The wood people had no soul, they had no spirit, they had no inner life, no consciousness, no capacity for genuine recognition, or genuine understanding, or genuine prayer. They could produce the outward forms of these activities, the mechanical movements, and the structured sounds and the organized behaviors that looked like what the gods wanted. But they could not produce the inner experience that gives those forms meaning. They were hollow. Not physically hollow, though their carved bodies may have been literally empty inside, but spiritually hollow, existentially hollow, hollow in the dimension that matters most to a creator who is seeking not just a creature that can perform the actions of worship, but a creature that can actually worship, that can actually feel the recognition and gratitude and connection that worship requires. They could walk and talk and multiply, but they could not feel. They could not understand. They could not look at the world around them and see it as something meaningful, something that required response, something that demanded acknowledgement and prayer, and the kind of reciprocal relationship that the gods were trying to establish. This spiritual emptiness was the seed of their failure, the hidden flaw that would eventually bring them down just as surely as the physical instability brought down the mud people. But for now, in the early days of the third creation, this flaw was not yet visible. The wood people walked and talked and multiplied, and the gods watched, and the world seemed, for a brief and precarious interval, to be working. But the illusion of success could not hold. The gods had solved the problem of form. They had solved the problem of stability. They had solved the problem of mechanical function. But they had not solved the problem that mattered most. They had not solved the problem of meaning. The Popol Vuh states it with a clarity that feels almost brutal in its simplicity. These wooden beings had no heart. They had no mind. They had no understanding. They walked through a world that had been carefully constructed for them, a world of mountains and rivers and forests and animals, and they perceived none of it. Not really. Not in the way that perception requires, not in the way that involves recognition and response, and the kind of inner experience that transforms mere sensory input into genuine awareness. They saw the mountains but did not feel awe. They drank from the rivers but did not feel gratitude. They harvested the forests but did not recognize that something had been given to them, that the abundance around them was not simply available but deliberately provided, that the world they inhabited was a gift requiring acknowledgement. Their existence was mechanical in the deepest and most troubling sense, not just in the stiffness of their movements or the flatness of their speech, but in the fundamental architecture of their being. They processed information without understanding it. They responded to stimuli without interpreting them. They performed actions without intending them. Imagine what this must have looked like from the perspective of the creators. You have built beings who can walk and talk and work and reproduce. You have watched them spread across the surface of the earth and fill it with their presence. You have seen them build houses and make tools and establish the outward structures of organized life. And yet when you look closer, when you observe them not just in motion but in stillness, not just in action but in rest, you realize that something essential is absent. They do not pause. They do not reflect. They do not stand at the edge of a river and watch the water flowing and feel something that cannot be articulated. But that is nonetheless real. That is nonetheless the foundation of everything you were trying to create when you first spoke the words that began the formation of the earth. They do not look up at the sky and wonder. They do not sit in the shade of a tree and feel peace. They do not experience any of the inner states that make existence worthwhile, that make consciousness a gift rather than a burden, that make the relationship between a being and its world something more than mere occupancy. And most critically, Most devastatingly, from the perspective of the Divine Council, they do not remember their creators. They do not remember the gods who carved them, who shaped their bodies and gave them the capacity to walk and talk and multiply. They do not offer prayers. They do not give thanks. They do not perform the rituals of acknowledgement that would complete the circuit between maker and made, that would transform the act of creation from a unilateral projection into a reciprocal relationship. The Popol Vuh describes this failure with a phrase that resonates through the entire narrative. They did not remember the heart of sky. They did not remember the heart of earth. They existed within the creation, but they did not recognize the creators. They inhabited the world, but they did not acknowledge its source. They walked and talked and worked and reproduced and built and multiplied, and through all of it, through all of their prolific and seemingly successful existence, they never once turned their attention toward the beings who had made them, never once directed their speech toward the sky, never once expressed the gratitude that the gods required. This was not simply a failure of manners. This was not simply a failure of etiquette or protocol or the expected forms of respectful behavior. This was a failure of being, a failure that revealed the fundamental hollowness at the core of the third creation. A being that cannot recognize its creator is a being that cannot recognize meaning. A being that cannot offer gratitude is a being that cannot experience value. A being that cannot pray is a being that cannot transcend the mechanical operation of its own functions and reach towards something larger than itself, something that connects the individual to the cosmic, the temporary to the eternal, the created to the creative. And the gods noticed the heart of sky, the heart of earth, the divine council that had poured so much effort and so much hope into this third attempt. They observed the emptiness of their creations, and they felt something that the Popol Vuh does not name explicitly, but that we can infer from what comes next. Dissatisfaction, disappointment, a growing sense that this creation, despite its surface success, despite its apparent functionality, despite its prolific multiplication across the face of the earth, had failed in the dimension that mattered most. They had made beings who could perform the actions of life, but who could not experience the meaning of life. They had made creatures who could occupy the world, but who could not connect to it. They had made forms that could move and speak, but that could not feel or understand or remember. The tension between creator and creation was building. The gods had made 3 attempts now, 3 different materials, 3 different approaches, and each time something essential had been missing. The animals could not speak. The mud people could not hold their form. The wood people could not feel. Each failure had revealed a different dimension of the problem, a different requirement that had not been met, a different aspect of what it means to be a being capable of genuine relationship with its creator and its world. And each failure had brought the gods closer to a reckoning with the nature of their own project. Creation is not merely fabrication. It is not merely the arrangement of matter into functional shapes. It requires something beyond the material, something beyond the mechanical, something that cannot be carved into wood or moulded from clay or breathed into animal bodies. It requires a quality that the gods had not yet found a way to provide, and the wood people in their empty and prolific and forgetful existence were demonstrating this absence with every step they took, every word they spoke, every day they lived without prayer, without gratitude, without memory of the hands that had made them. The punishment was coming. The gods would not tolerate another failure. They would not watch their creations proliferate across the earth in meaningless abundance, while the sky above remained unaddressed, while the names of the creators remained unspoken, while the fundamental requirement of the relationship remained unmet. But before the punishment, there was a further demonstration of the wood people's emptiness, a demonstration that would prove just how hollow their existence had truly become. The demonstration came from below, from the things they had used without care, from the creatures they had dominated without compassion. The Popol Vuh describes a reversal so complete, so thoroughly inverted that the very architecture of daily existence turned against those who had lived within it. The grinding stones spoke first. These were the metates, the flat stone surfaces where the wood people processed their maize, where they crushed the seeds and kernels that sustained their prolific multiplication. Day after day, generation after generation, the grinding stones had endured the weight of hands pressing down, the friction of grain being worked into meal, the relentless repetitive motion of bodies using them as tools. And now, in the moment of reckoning, they remembered every stroke, every pressure, every moment they had been treated as inert objects rather than participants in a shared process. The Popol Vuh, says the grinding stones, flew from their resting places. They rose up. They moved of their own accord, no longer passive surfaces awaiting manipulation, but active agents seeking redress. They crushed the hands that had pressed them. They broke the fingers that had worked them. They exacted a physical justice that mirrored exactly the treatment they had received. Then the cooking pots joined the uprising. The vessels that had held the food, that had endured the fire, that had contained the nourishment, which the wood people consumed without gratitude or acknowledgement, they too found voice and motion. They lifted themselves from the hearths. They spilled their contents not as offerings, but as weapons. They struck the faces that had fed from them. They burned the mouths that had eaten without blessing, without prayer, without any recognition that the food they consumed was a gift from the creators who had made both the vessel and the contents it held. Every domestic object became an enemy, the plates that had served the meals, the cups that had held the water, the knives that had cut the meat, the fire that had warmed the homes, each of these things which the wood people had handled as mere instruments of their daily functioning, revealed themselves as beings with their own capacity for response, their own ability to act, their own will to resist. The fire burned them now, not as a tool providing comfort, but as an angry presence punishing negligence. The knives cut not the meat prepared for consumption, but the hands that had wielded them without respect. The plates shattered against the faces that had eaten from them in mechanical hunger. And then the animals came. They came not as prey or as servants or as resources to be exploited, but as witnesses, as accusers, as beings who had suffered under the dominion of creatures who possessed no soul, no understanding, no capacity for the empathy that should govern the relationship between those who have power and those who do not. The Popol Vuh gives them a voice. It lets them speak. It lets them recount the specific abuses they endured. The deer said, "We were hunted without ceremony. We were killed without prayer. Our flesh was taken without gratitude, and our bones were discarded without respect." The birds said, "We were snared and captured, our wings broken, our songs silenced, and our bodies consumed as though we were merely food, rather than beings who shared the creation." The dogs said, "We were beaten and starved, we were driven and abandoned, we were treated as possessions rather than companions, and when we could no longer serve, we were left to die without acknowledgement." Each animal told its story. Each creature described the pattern of use without care, of exploitation without recognition, of dominance without the corresponding responsibility that should accompany any relationship in which one being holds power over another. In Maya cosmology, this pattern of reversal reveals something fundamental about the nature of creation. The world is not merely a resource. The beings within it, whether they are grinding stones or cooking pots or deer or birds or dogs, are not merely instruments available for unlimited use. They exist within a framework of relationship and obligation. When that framework is violated, when beings treat other beings as though they have no significance beyond their utility, the framework itself responds. The balance reasserts itself, not gently, not gradually, but with the sudden and overwhelming force of something that has been compressed and constrained and finally released. The Wood People experienced this reassertion as pure terror. They ran through their houses while the objects they had owned pursued them. They fled through their villages while the animals they had dominated hunted them. They scrambled over the walls they had built while the fire they had controlled consumed them. And they could not understand what was happening. They could not interpret the meaning of the uprising. They could not grasp the significance of the rebellion, because they had no heart, because they had no mind, because they had no capacity for the kind of reflection that would have allowed them to recognize that what they were experiencing was not random chaos, but structured justice, not arbitrary violence, but proportional response, not meaningless destruction, but the logical consequence of their own meaningless existence. They had treated the world as though it contained no meaning, and now the world was treating them the same way. They had regarded other beings as objects, and now those beings were regarding them as obstacles to be removed. They had lived without acknowledgement, and now they were being destroyed without acknowledgement. The pattern was complete. The circle had closed. The emptiness they had embodied had finally turned inward and consumed them from the outside. But the uprising of the tools and the animals, the reversal of domestic order, was only the beginning. The creators had determined that the Wood People would not simply be punished. They would be erased, removed from the surface of the earth so completely that only the faintest echoes of their existence would remain. And the instrument of that erasure was water. The Popol Vuh describes a flood unlike any ordinary inundation. This was not rising river water from seasonal rains. This was not the slow creeping advance of a lake overflowing its boundaries during a storm. This was something altogether different, a great resin-like flood, thick and heavy, descending from the sky itself, a deluge that was not merely water, but a sticky, suffocating substance that coated everything it touched, that sealed and trapped and drowned in a manner that ordinary water could not. The text uses the word resin, and this detail carries weight. Resin is the blood of trees. It is the substance that flows from damaged wood, that seals wounds in bark, that preserves and encases and hardens into amber over millennia. The same material that composed the bodies of the Wood People, the substance that gave them their form and structure, now became the medium of their destruction. They were drowning in the essence of what they were. Their own nature, the very material that defined their existence, was turned against them in a flood so total that escape became impossible. The Wood People tried to flee. The previous section described their terror as their own households turned against them, as the grinding stones and the cooking pots and the fire rose up in violent rebellion. Now that terror escalated into something beyond panic, beyond the frantic scrambling of creatures reacting to immediate physical threat. This was the terror of annihilation. They ran from their burning houses and found the world outside equally hostile. They climbed the walls of their villages and discovered that the waters were rising faster than any wall could contain. They sought refuge in the highest places they could reach, the hilltops, the peaks, the elevated locations that had never before been threatened by any flood. But the resin-like waters followed them. The waters rose to meet them wherever they went. They attempted to hide in the branches of trees, perhaps seeking safety in the wooden structures that mirrored their own composition. But the trees themselves were being consumed. They tried to shelter in caves, burrowing into the earth like animals seeking escape from a surface catastrophe. But the caves filled with the heavy dark substance and became tombs. They scrambled onto the rooftops of their homes, the last elevated surfaces available to them, but the rooftops dissolved under the weight of the descending flood, and the Wood People fell into the waters that had risen to receive them. None of their strategies worked. None of their efforts to survive produced results. And this failure was itself a reflection of their fundamental nature. They had no capacity for innovation, no ability to develop new responses to unprecedented situations, no creative intelligence that might have allowed them to find some novel path to safety. They could only repeat the same basic patterns of flight and hiding that any frightened animal would exhibit, and those patterns were insufficient against a disaster engineered by divine will. The flood in the Popol Vuh functions as more than a practical mechanism for destroying a failed creation. It operates as an expression of judgment, a definitive statement from the creators that this version of humanity had violated the fundamental terms of existence and could no longer be permitted to populate the earth. The waters are not random, they are intentional, they are directed. They carry the weight of a decision made by Heart of Sky and Heart of Earth after watching the Wood People multiply without gratitude, after witnessing their exploitation of the animals and the land, after receiving the testimony of every creature that had suffered under their careless dominion. The flood is the enactment of that decision. It is the physical manifestation of a conclusion reached through observation and deliberation. And in this sense, the Popol Vuh joins a tradition that extends far beyond the highlands of Guatemala. Flood myths appear across an extraordinary range of cultures. The Sumerian epic of Gilgamesh contains a flood narrative that predates the Popol Vuh by thousands of years and shares striking structural similarities, including the divine decision to destroy humanity, the selection of a favoured survivor, and the restoration of the world after the waters recede. The Hebrew Genesis account describes a flood sent as explicit divine judgment against a civilization that had filled the earth with violence and corruption. Greek mythology preserves the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha, survivors of a deluge that Zeus sent to punish a humanity that had abandoned its obligations to the gods. Hindu traditions speak of Manu, who was warned by a fish of an approaching flood and built a boat to preserve life while the world was cleansed. These parallels do not necessarily indicate a single shared source, though some scholars have proposed that certain flood narratives may trace back to ancient memories of catastrophic rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, when meltwater pulses transformed coastlines and displaced populations across multiple continents. Others suggest that flood myths may reflect a deeper structural pattern in human cosmological thinking, a recurring recognition that creation and destruction operate as paired forces, that worlds are built and then unmade when the terms of their existence are violated. The Popol Vuh sits within this broader tradition while maintaining its own distinctive character. The resin-like flood, the specific material correspondence between the substance of the Wood People and the medium of their destruction, the integration of the flood with the preceding rebellion of tools and animals, all of these elements belong specifically to the Maya narrative and cannot be reduced to a generic template borrowed from elsewhere. The flood accomplishes its purpose completely. The Wood People are destroyed. Not merely diminished, not simply reduced in number, but eliminated as a viable form of humanity. Their bodies dissolve in the resin-like waters. Their populations vanish from the surface of the earth. The villages they built, the fields they cultivated, the networks of dominance they established across the landscape, all of these are swept away and submerged beneath the descending deluge, and the world that remains is empty again, desolate, silent, cleared of the failed creation and waiting, as it had waited after the dissolution of the Mud People, as it had waited after the failure of the animals to speak, for another attempt, for another approach, for a form of humanity that might finally fulfill the purpose that the creators had envisioned from the beginning, when they first looked across the primordial void and decided that the world should contain beings who could acknowledge them, who could remember them, who could speak their names and sustain the relationship between creator and created that gives meaning to existence itself. But the annihilation was not absolute. The Popol Vuh does not describe a complete erasure. A fragment of the Wood People survived the descending waters. Not through cunning or innovation, because they possessed neither. Not through divine favour, because they had exhausted whatever patience the creators might once have held for them. They survived through what seems at first glance to be a peculiar act of transformation rather than outright destruction. The survivors of the resin flood were changed, their wooden bodies, which had failed them so completely in their human form, were remade into something else entirely. They became monkeys. The text presents this transformation with a kind of stark simplicity that leaves considerable room for interpretation. The wood people who escaped the flood became monkeys. They were turned into simians. Their shape shifted, their nature altered, and they took up residence in the forests and the canopy, swinging through branches and chattering in voices that bore a haunting resemblance to the speech they had never truly mastered as humans. This is not merely a convenient explanation for why monkeys exist in the world. The Maya did not require a mythological origin story for every creature they encountered. Monkeys were familiar animals, abundant in the tropical forests of the highlands and the lowlands, observable in their daily habits and their social behaviours. The transformation of the wood people into monkeys serves a deeper symbolic purpose within the narrative architecture of the Popol Vuh. Monkeys in this context function as living monuments to failure. They are reminders embedded in the fabric of the natural world itself, perpetual visual echoes of a humanity that could not fulfill its purpose. When the Maya looked at monkeys in the forest, they were not simply seeing animals. They were seeing the ghosts of a previous creation, beings that had once walked on two legs, had once built houses and cultivated fields, had once dominated the landscape with their numbers and their careless exploitation, but had lost everything because they lacked the essential qualities that define true humanity. The physical and behavioural parallels between monkeys and the wood people reinforce this symbolic connection. Monkeys resemble humans in their general form more closely than almost any other creature. Their hands, their faces, their social groupings, their tendency to chatter and vocalize without producing meaningful language, all of these traits map onto the deficiencies that the Popol Vuh identifies in the wood people. They look almost right. They sound almost right, but they are not right. They are a near miss, a creation that approached the threshold of genuine humanity and then fell back, retaining the outward shape but missing the inner substance. This is precisely what the wood people were. They had the form of humans, the numbers of humans, the activities of humans, but they possessed no soul, no gratitude, no capacity for remembrance or acknowledgement of their creators. The transformation into monkeys made this truth visible in the living world. The monkey's resemblance to humanity without its substance became a physical embodiment of the wood people's fundamental failure. In Maya art and iconography, monkeys occupy a complex and multifaceted position that extends beyond their role in the Popol Vuh narrative. They appear in ceramic paintings and stone carvings as figures of playfulness and trickery, sometimes associated with the arts, particularly with music and writing. The monkey god, sometimes identified as Hunahpu or related to the broader category of simian deities, appears in certain contexts as a patron of craftsmen and performers. This dual nature, the monkey as both a symbol of failed humanity and a figure of creative expression, may seem contradictory at first, but it actually reflects a coherent understanding of what the wood people represented. They were not evil in the manner of malicious beings who deliberately chose destruction and cruelty. They were incomplete. They lacked the depth and the moral substance that would have allowed them to be genuinely good, but they also lacked the capacity for genuine evil. They existed in a shallow middle ground of mere existence, going through the motions of life without engaging its deeper dimensions. Playfulness, trickery, surface charm, without underlying significance. These are the qualities that monkeys embody in Maya artistic tradition, and they are precisely the qualities that characterized the wood people during their brief and unsuccessful tenure as the inhabitants of the earth. The transformation into monkeys also carried an element that could be interpreted as mercy, though this interpretation requires careful qualification because the text does not explicitly frame it in those terms. Total annihilation would have meant the complete erasure of the Wood People from every dimension of existence. Transformation into monkeys allowed a fragment of them to persist, to continue living in the forests, to remain as visible evidence of what had happened, to serve their function as reminders and warnings. They lost their human form and their dominion over the earth, but they were not reduced to nothing. They were permitted to exist in a diminished state, stripped of the pretensions that had made their human form a mockery of genuine humanity, confined to a shape that accurately reflected their actual nature. Whether this constitutes mercy or simply utility depends on how one reads the Creator's intentions. The monkeys serve a purpose in the renewed world. They remind future creations of the consequences of failure. They demonstrate that the gods do not simply erase their mistakes, but transform them, incorporate them into the living landscape as evidence of the iterative process that creation requires. The Wood People, in their monkey form, became part of the ecological and symbolic fabric of the world that would eventually be populated by genuine humanity, the Maize people who would succeed where mud and wood had failed. But the Popol Vuh does not move immediately from the destruction of the Wood People to the creation of the Maize people. The narrative takes a different path, one that descends into darker and more complex territory before ascending to its culmination. The story of creation's failures has been told. The Mud People dissolved. The Wood People drowned in their own substance and were transformed into chattering echoes of their former selves. Now the text shifts its focus entirely, leaving the realm of cosmic creation and entering the mythic depths of a different kind of story. A story of death and deception and impossible triumph. A story that begins, as so many stories do, with a journey into the Underworld. The Underworld of the Maya goes by a name that carries a weight far beyond simple translation. Xibalba. In the Xquic language recorded in the Popol Vuh, this word resonates with meanings that cluster around fear, disappearance, and the terrifying unknown. The place of fright, the place of disappearance. It is not merely a realm of the dead, a passive repository where souls drift after the body fails. Xibalba is an active entity, a functioning kingdom with rulers, laws, customs, and most importantly, intention. It hunts, it schemes, it extends its reach into the world above, drawing the living down into its darkness, through deception and challenge. The lords of this realm are not vague shadows or impersonal forces of decay. They have names, they have specific domains of cruelty. They sit in authority within their subterranean court, passing judgments and devising trials that serve no purpose beyond humiliation and destruction. 1 death and 7 death occupy the highest positions, the ruling lords whose commands shape the governance of the underworld. Below them serve a council of fearsome figures, whose very names encode their function. Flying Scab, Gathered Blood, Puss Master, Jaundice Master, Bone Staff, Skull Staff, Sweeping's Blood, Stabber Blood. These are not poetic titles meant to inspire awe. They are clinical descriptions of affliction and torment. Each lord embodies a specific dimension of human suffering. The diseases that eat flesh from bone, the infections that turn blood to corruption, the inevitable decay that awaits every living body. They are the architect of mortality made into governance. When someone in the world above falls ill with a fever that will not break, when a wound festers beyond healing, when a healthy body suddenly turns cold and stops, the Popol Vuh attributes these events to the reach of Xibalba. The lords are working their purpose in the upper world, even before a soul descends to meet them face to face. The structure of Xibalba itself reflects this systematic intentionality. It is not a chaotic abyss, it is an architecture of trial, a sequence of constructed spaces designed to test, confuse, and ultimately destroy anyone who enters. The path to the Council of the Lords passes through multiple houses, each one a concentrated chamber of specific torment. The dark house, a room of absolute and unyielding blackness, where nothing can be seen and orientation becomes impossible. The razor house, where walls and floor bristle with sharp blades that move and shift, cutting anything that moves carelessly. The cold house, filled with an icy wind that freezes marrow and makes breath visible before it vanishes. The jaguar house, where prowling predators wait in shadows for whatever prey is thrust inside. The bat house, swarming with shrieking creatures that descend in frenzy on anyone trapped within. And the hottest of all, the obsidian house, a chamber of searing heat and jagged glass-like stone. These houses are not mere obstacles. They are intentional designs constructed by the Lords of Death as a gauntlet that must be run before any visitor can even approach the seat of authority. Passing through them requires not just endurance but knowledge, cleverness, the ability to perceive traps that are designed to be invisible until they spring. The Maya did not simply fear Xibalba, they respected it with a depth of reverence that modern sensibilities might struggle to fully comprehend. This was not a realm to be avoided through righteous living or spiritual purity. The underworld was woven into the fundamental structure of reality. The sun itself descended into Xibalba every evening, travelling through its darkness before rising again in the east. Seeds planted in the earth passed through a kind of underworld death before germinating and pushing upward into the light. Xibalba was not an aberration in the cosmic order. It was an essential component, the dark counterpart that made the bright world above possible and meaningful. To understand the world as the Maya understood it, you had to account for Xibalba's presence and power. The Lords of Death were not enemies to be defeated in some final apocalyptic confrontation. They were permanent fixtures of existence, as inevitable and necessary as sunset, as the rot that returns organic matter to soil, as the expiration that defines the boundary of every living span. And yet, within this framework of respect and acknowledgement, the Popol Vuh introduces something extraordinary. A narrative thread that does not simply accept Xibalba's dominion, but actively challenges it. The text has established the underworld's power, its architecture, its systematic cruelty, the comprehensive authority of its lords over disease and death. Now it prepares to introduce figures who will enter this realm not as passive victims descending after mortal expiration, but as challengers arriving with purpose and intent. The story shifts from cosmic creation history to something far more personal and immediate. A story of specific individuals facing specific lords, navigating specific houses of trial with cunning and defiance rather than resigned acceptance. The Lords of Xibalba have ruled their darkness for ages uncounted, harvesting the living from the world above, maintaining their kingdom of affliction without serious challenge. But something is coming. The narrative architecture of the Popol Vuh has been building toward this confrontation from the earliest passages, and now the stage is fully set for mortal challengers to descend into the realm that has claimed every soul before them, carrying with them the possibility, however remote, that death's dominion might not be as absolute as it appears. Before the challenge arrives, before any mortal dares to descend with intent, the Popol Vuh introduces two figures whose lives will set the entire confrontation in motion. Their names are Hunahpu and Hunahpu, 1 Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu. They are not gods of creation, not members of the divine council that shaped the world from primordial void. They exist somewhere between the celestial and the earthly, born of that generation which came after the world's fundamental architecture was established, but before the successful creation of true human beings. They are figures of a transitional age, inhabiting a world that is complete in its physical form, but still waiting for the beings who will give it purpose through worship and sustenance. The text describes these brothers with a striking specificity that feels almost intimate. They are defined, above all, by a single consuming passion, the ballgame. In the Maya worldview, this was no mere sport, no casual diversion to fill idle hours. The ballgame was a ritual of cosmic significance, a enacted drama that echoed the movements of celestial bodies, the cycles of agricultural fertility, the perpetual tension between forces of life and death. The ball court itself was understood as a liminal space, an opening between the world above and the world below, a crack in reality, where the influence of Xibalba could seep upward into the daylight realm. And Hunahpu and Hunahpu played this game with absolute dedication. Day after day they gathered at the court. They played with skill and intensity that transcended ordinary competition. The rubber ball flew between them in patterns that almost resembled dance, their bodies moving with precision and grace that spoke of deep mastery, of countless hours devoted to perfecting this sacred practice. But their devotion carried a fatal consequence. The game was not quiet. The striking of the rubber ball against the court surface produced a deep, resonant sound, a thunderous percussion that echoed across the landscape. And this noise, this relentless drumming of sacred play, travelled downward. It reached Xibalba. It reached the council of the Lords of Death in their subterranean court. One death and 7 death heard it. The lesser lords heard it. Flying Scab and Gathered Blood and Puss Master heard it. And their response was not one of respect for the sacred ritual. It was irritation, anger. The noise of the ball game above was an intrusion, an insult to the quiet order of their dark kingdom. Who were these players, these beings from the world of light, making such racket, such commotion, disrupting the stillness that the Lords of Death preferred? The summons was issued, a formal challenge carrying the appearance of honour and invitation, but concealing the architecture of destruction. The Lords of Xibalba sent their messengers upward, owls who served as intermediaries between the realms, bearing a challenge to come down and play, to bring their skill, their ball, their equipment, and compete against the Lords of Death on the ball court of Xibalba itself. The brothers accepted. They prepared themselves with the ritual care appropriate for such a journey, gathering their playing gear, making arrangements for those they would leave behind. And then they descended. The path down into Xibalba was not straightforward. The Popol Vuh describes a series of transitions, crossings between realms that strip away the familiar markers of the world above. The brothers passed through places of confusion and deception, encountering obstacles designed to disorient and disarm them before they even reached the formal trials of the houses. They crossed rivers, they navigated treacherous passages, they encountered figures who seemed to offer guidance but delivered mockery. And when they finally arrived at the Council of the Lords, they fell victim to the first and most fundamental trap. The Lords of Xibalba seated themselves on their thrones of authority, arranged in a formation that presented an illusion of welcome and respect. But the central seat, the place that appeared most honoured, was a bench of burning stone. When Hunahpu and Hunahpu sat upon it, the heat seared their bodies, burning their flesh, destroying their dignity and their strength before the contest had even begun. They were defeated before the ball was ever struck. The trials of the houses followed, each one claiming more of their vitality and resilience. And finally, in the culmination of this orchestrated destruction, the Lords of Xibalba took the brothers and sacrificed them. They buried their bodies in the earth of the Underworld, consigning them to the fate that Xibalba claimed for all who entered its domain. But they reserved one piece, one fragment of the defeated pair that would serve a different purpose. The head of Hunahpu was separated from his body, and the Lords of Death, with a cruelty that transcended mere killing, placed this head in the branches of a calabash tree, a gourd-bearing tree that grew in the very place where the sacrifice had occurred. The tree, which had borne no fruit before, suddenly produced round, smooth gourds that resembled in their shape and appearance the severed head that hung among its branches. The head of Hunahpu became part of the landscape of Xibalba, a permanent monument to the Lord's victory, a warning to any who might consider challenging their dominion. The death of one Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu was complete. Their journey ended in absolute defeat. But the story of their challenge was not over, for the severed head in the calabash tree still held something within it, something that the Lords of Death had not accounted for, something that would, in time, prove to be the instrument of their undoing. The Lords of Xibalba believed their victory was absolute. Hunahpu and Xquic were dead, their bodies buried in the earth of the Underworld, their legacy extinguished in humiliation and sacrifice. The head of Hunahpu, impaled in the branches of the calabash tree, was meant to serve as a permanent testament to the power of death over life, a warning carved into the very landscape of the subterranean realm. But the Underworld, despite its association with decay and finality, was never a place of pure ending. The Maya understood Xibalba as a realm of transformation, where the remnants of what had been could gestate into what would come. And in the branches of that tree, something was already stirring, waiting for the right moment to bridge the gap between defeat and destiny. That moment arrived with a figure who seems at first glance to occupy the margins of the story. Her name is Xquic, in the language of the Quiche Maya. This name carries a meaning that scholars have debated, some suggesting it relates to blood or to the essence of life itself. She is described as the daughter of one of the lords of Xibalba, a being born into the very hierarchy that had engineered the destruction of the ball-playing brothers. She was, by birth and by circumstance, aligned with the forces of death. And yet the narrative treats her not as an antagonist, but as a vessel of extraordinary potential, a figure whose actions would set in motion the most pivotal sequence in the entire Popol Vuh. The text tells us that Xquic heard of the calabash tree. She learned of the strange fruit that had appeared on its branches after the head of Hunahpu was placed there, round and smooth gourds that seemed almost impossible, growing from a tree that had previously borne nothing. And something stirred within her, curiosity, a desire to see this thing that had become part of the landscape of her father's kingdom, this relic of the defeated challenger that had somehow transformed the very nature of the tree it occupied. The Popol Vuh does not explain her motivation in psychological terms. It simply presents her impulse as something natural, almost inevitable, as though the attraction between this young woman of the underworld and the remnant of the sacrificed hero above was ordained by forces larger than either of them could comprehend. She went to the tree. She stood beneath its branches and looked up at the fruit, those pale gourds hanging in the underworld air. And then the skull, the severed head of Hunahpu, spoke. It addressed her directly, asking why she had come, why she was reaching for something that did not belong to her. Xquic responded with a declaration of need. She expressed a desire for the fruit, a hunger that may have been literal but resonates throughout the narrative as something far deeper, a reaching towards sustenance and significance that her existence in Xibalba had failed to provide. And the skull, in response, did something that defies every natural law governing the separation between life and death. It opened its mouth, and from that mouth came not words alone, but something tangible, something that carried the essence of the dead hero into the living daughter of the underworld. The text describes this moment with a phrase that has fascinated and perplexed scholars for generations. The skull spat into Xquic's hand, or, depending on interpretation, it breathed into her palm. The distinction matters for understanding the symbolic weight of the moment. Spit, in Maya thought, was associated with saliva as a substance of life, a carrier of vital force. Breath carried similar associations, the animating principle that distinguished the living from the dead. Whatever the precise translation, the meaning is clear. The severed head of the sacrificed hero transmitted its living essence directly into the body of the underworld maiden. Xquic became pregnant, not through any act that we would recognize as conventional conception, not through the physical union of two living bodies, but through a miraculous transmission that bypassed every boundary between death and life, between the decaying remnant and the fertile vessel. The implications of this event ripple outward through the entire structure of the narrative. A figure of Xibalba, daughter of the lords who had engineered Hunahpu's destruction, now carried within her womb the continuation of his lineage. The very power that had sought to eliminate the challenge to its dominion had, through its own cruelty and display, inadvertently created the conditions for that challenge to be reborn. The severed head, placed in the tree as a monument to victory, had become a source of new life. But Xquic's position was now precarious beyond description. In the rigid hierarchy of Xibalba, her condition was an outrage, a violation of the order that the Lords of Death maintained. When her father learned of her pregnancy, his response was immediate and absolute. She was to be killed. The Lords of Xibalba demanded her execution, ordering her to be sacrificed in the same manner as the brothers who had descended before her, her blood offered to sustain the dark powers that ruled the underworld. The sentence was carried to her through intermediaries, messengers who served the will of one death and seven death. But Xquic, facing annihilation, did something that the lords had not anticipated. She fled. She escaped the bounds of Xibalba, ascending from the underworld toward the surface of the earth, guided perhaps by the very force that now grew within her, the instinct of preservation that transcended the fatal logic of her father's realm. The Popol Vuh does not detail the mechanics of her escape. It presents her departure as a crossing between worlds, a transit from the domain of death to the domain of life that mirrors, in reverse, the fatal descent of Hunahpu and Hunahpu. Where they had gone down into destruction, she rose toward survival, carrying within her the seed of their continuation. Her journey ended at a specific destination, one that tied her fate directly to the lineage of the man whose essence she now bore. She arrived at the home of Hunahpu's mother, the woman who had witnessed her son's departure for Xibalba, and had, presumably, received word of his death. And Xquic presented herself before this grieving matriarch, declaring who she was, whose child she carried, and demanding recognition and shelter. The mother's initial response was rejection. She could not accept that this girl, this daughter of the lords who had killed her son, could legitimately carry his lineage. The mechanism of conception was beyond her understanding, beyond any framework that the surface world provided for explaining how life could pass from a dead man's severed head into a living woman's womb. The proof would come later in the birth of the children, in the demonstration of their nature and their purpose. For now, Xquic had crossed the boundary between worlds and claimed her place in the story, transforming from a peripheral figure of the underworld into the central vessel of the narrative's resolution. The themes embedded in her story speak to something fundamental in Maya cosmology. The notion that life emerges from death, not in opposition to it, but through engagement with it, that the forces which seek to destroy can inadvertently create, that destiny can be carried in hidden form, gestating in the most unlikely vessels, waiting for the moment when it will reveal itself and reshape the balance of power between the world above and the world below. The children born of that impossible conception emerged into a world that did not want them. Xquic gave birth to twin sons, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, and from their first moments their existence was defined by opposition. They entered a household still shadowed by grief, where their grandmother, the mother of the sacrificed Hunahpu, continued to mourn the son she had lost to the underworld. And they entered alongside two older boys, the sons of Hunahpu's first union, known in the text as one monkey and one artisan. These half-brothers received the twins not as kin but as rivals, as unwelcome intruders whose arrival disrupted the order of the household and threatened to claim attention and resources that had previously belonged to them alone. The mistreatment began immediately and persisted throughout the twins' early years. One monkey and one artisan taunted them, excluded them, assigned them the most menial tasks. While the older brothers occupied themselves with artistic pursuits, carving and writing, playing the flute and creating music, activities that marked them as cultivated and accomplished in the eyes of their grandmother, Hunahpu and Xbalanque were sent into the fields to work. They carried tools they had not chosen to wield. They cleared land that did not belong to them. They ate scraps and leftovers while their half-brothers sat at the centre of the household's attention. The grandmother, still absorbed in her grief and her partiality for the sons of her son's earlier marriage, did not intervene. She saw the twins as burdens, as reminders of the strange and incomprehensible circumstances of their origin, and she allowed the older boys to maintain their position of dominance without challenge. But the Popol Vuh makes clear, from the very first descriptions of Hunahpu and Xbalanque, that something was fundamentally different about them. Beneath their apparent subservience, beneath the quiet endurance of their daily mistreatment, they possessed capacities that their tormentors could not perceive and could not imagine. The text attributes to them an innate cleverness, a quality of mind that went far beyond mere intelligence. They understood things that had not been taught to them. They perceived patterns and possibilities that remained invisible to those around them, and they carried within themselves, though it had not yet manifested in full, the extraordinary abilities that would eventually carry them through the trials of Xibalba and into confrontation with the Lords of Death itself. The first demonstration of these hidden capacities came through an act that the narrative presents with a characteristic blend of mischief and cosmic significance. The twins, having endured years of contempt, devised a strategy to transform the dynamic of the household. They did not challenge their half-brothers through direct confrontation, which would have been futile given the older boy's established position and the grandmother's favoritism. Instead, they used cleverness, the quality that defined them, to engineer a reversal so complete that it removed their rivals from the human world entirely. They invited one monkey and one artisan to follow them to a specific place, promising something that appealed to the older boy's vanity and their desire for control. And when the brothers followed, when they entered the space that the twins had prepared, Hunahpu and Xbalanque enacted a transformation that has resonated through Maya storytelling for centuries. They turned their half-brothers into monkeys. The text describes this metamorphosis with deliberate symbolic weight. Monkeys, in Maya thought, occupied a complex position, creatures that resembled humans in form and behaviour, but lacked the faculties of speech and reason that defined true humanity. They were echoes of the human shape without the human essence, imitative and chaotic, incapable of the deliberate creation that distinguished genuine artistry from mere mimicry. One monkey and one artisan, who had prided themselves on their artistic accomplishments, were reduced to creatures whose behaviour was mere imitation, whose sounds were noise rather than language, whose cleverness had become the empty mimicry of the animals they became. Their grandmother, witnessing this transformation, was devastated. She begged the twins to restore her older grandsons to their human form, and the twins, demonstrating the complex morality that would characterize their entire journey, complied partially. They allowed the monkeys to reassume human shape briefly, but only under specific conditions, conditions that the grandmother inevitably violated through her grief and her desperation. The transformation became permanent. One monkey and one artisan vanished into the forest, becoming the ancestors of the monkeys that would inhabit the Maya world thereafter, living reminders of a failed branch of the lineage, a path that led away from the destiny that the twins would fulfill. With their rivals removed, Hunahpu and Xbalanque turned their attention to an activity that connected them directly to the father they had never known. They began to play the ball game. Every day they crossed the court that their father and their uncle had used before them, striking the rubber ball back and forth across the marked surface, developing a mastery that seemed to emerge from somewhere beyond practice, somewhere rooted in the very lineage they carried. The noise of their play reached the lords of Xibalba, and the lords of death, hearing that sound, recognized it immediately. The same challenge had arrived again, carried in the bodies of the sons of the man they had destroyed. The twins' destiny was drawing them, inevitably and irresistibly, toward the confrontation that their father had failed to survive, toward the underworld itself. The summons came as it had come for their father, carried by the messengers of Xibalba, the owl-faced emissaries who moved between the world of the living and the world of the dead with practiced indifference. They arrived at the ball court and delivered the challenge with the same formal language, the same manufactured courtesy that had lured one Hunahpu and 7 Hunahpu to their destruction years before. The lords of death invited the twins to come down, to bring their ball, their equipment, to play against the rulers of the underworld in the court that waited below. The invitation was a command dressed in politeness, and its true purpose was exactly what it had been for the previous generation, to draw the challengers into a realm where every advantage belonged to the hosts, where the rules of existence itself served the interests of those who had crafted them. But Hunahpu and Xbalanque were not their father. They had grown up hearing the story of what happened to one Hunahpu, had absorbed every detail of his descent, his deception, his defeat. They understood in a way that their father never had, that the lords of Xibalba operated through trickery, through the exploitation of politeness and expectation, through the manipulation of visitors who entered their domain believing that the conventions of the upper world still applied. And so, when the messengers delivered their summons, the twins did something that their father had not done. They consulted, they sought advice from a figure whose knowledge of the underworld exceeded even that of its rulers. They went to their grandmother, and through her they learned the path that would allow them to descend without falling immediately into the first and most fatal of Xibalba's traps. The lords of death had established a system of deception that began at the very threshold of their realm. Visitors approaching Xibalba encountered what appeared to be a seat of honour, a bench carved and positioned to welcome distinguished guests, to offer rest and respect to those who had travelled far. But this bench, this seemingly generous provision, was a trap. Anyone who sat upon it would be seized, bound, offered up for sacrifice before they had even reached the council of the lords. One Hunahpu had fallen into this trap completely, accepting the offered seat as a mark of his status, not recognizing that in Xibalba every gesture of hospitality concealed a mechanism of destruction. His sons, armed with knowledge that he had lacked, saw the bench and recognized it for what it was. They did not sit, they acknowledged the greeting but declined the seat, and in that single act of refusal they passed through the first barrier that their father had failed to breach. The lords of Xibalba watched this refusal with something the text suggests was close to irritation. The twins had evaded the initial trap with an ease that indicated preparation, that suggested they had arrived knowing things that visitors should not know. But the lords maintained their composure and proceeded to the next phase of their system, the series of trial houses that had destroyed every challenger who had entered them before. These houses were designed to kill through specific forces, through concentrated dangers that no mortal body could withstand, and the twins were sent into them one by one, expected to perish as all others had perished. The first was the House of Jaguars, a room filled with jaguars bred and trained for destruction, animals whose only purpose was to tear apart whatever living thing entered their domain. The twins walked into this space of certain death and emerged unchanged. The text does not specify exactly how they survived, but the implication throughout the narrative is that they spoke to the jaguars, that they used some form of knowledge or persuasion, perhaps combined with the innate abilities that had defined them since birth, to convince the animals not to attack. They walked among creatures designed to kill them, and walked out again, as though the danger had been nothing more than an inconvenience. The House of Fire followed, a room where the flames were so intense, so all-consuming that no flesh could endure them for more than moments. And again the twins entered and emerged without injury. They did not burn, they passed through the fire, as though some protection surrounded them, as though their understanding of the Underworld's mechanisms extended even to the manipulation of its most elemental forces. Then came the House of Cold, a chamber where the freezing air penetrated instantly to the bone, where exposure meant swift and inevitable death. Hunahpu and Xbalanque survived this too, using knowledge that the text presents as both practical and somehow beyond the ordinary, perhaps fire they carried within themselves, perhaps an understanding of how to endure what should have been unendurable. The lords of Xibalba grew increasingly frustrated with each successful passage. Their system had worked perfectly for generations. Every visitor who entered the trial houses had died, had been broken by the concentrated forces that the lords had assembled, had provided the entertainment and the sacrifice that the rulers of death required. The twins were disrupting a process that had functioned without interruption since the Underworld's establishment. They were surviving through means that the lords could not fully understand, that seemed to operate according to different principles than the ones that governed Xibalba's power. The lords had built a domain where they controlled every variable, where every element served their will, and yet these two young men were moving through it as though the rules did not apply to them, as though they carried within themselves something that the lord's authority could not reach. The tension in the council chambers of Xibalba must have been considerable. The lords who had never been challenged, never been thwarted, never been forced to confront the possibility that their system might contain a flaw, were watching their certainty erode with each house the twins passed, and they knew that the final confrontation was approaching, that the moment would come when direct action would replace indirect destruction, when they would have to face these survivors not through the intermediary of their trial houses, but in open contest. The Lords of Death were preparing for a battle they had never expected to fight, and the twins, having survived everything that Xibalba had thrown at them so far, were moving steadily toward the encounter that would determine whether the Underworld's long reign of unchallenged power would continue, or whether something new, something that the Lords could not control, would emerge from the depths of their own domain. The twins understood something fundamental about Xibalba, something their father had never grasped. The Lords of Death held all the power in their domain, but their power depended on a single, unchallenged assumption: that death was final, that once a soul entered the Underworld, it belonged to them forever. This assumption had never been tested because no one had ever possessed the ability to test it. Every visitor who descended into Xibalba had died and stayed dead, confirming what the Lords believed about themselves, that they were the ultimate authority, the final word, the end of all things. Hunahpu and Xbalanque were about to challenge that assumption in the most dramatic way possible. They staged their own deaths, not through failure, not through defeat at the hands of the Lords, but through a deliberate, calculated performance designed to lead Xibalba's rulers into the very trap that had claimed one Hunahpu. The twins allowed themselves to be killed, or rather, they appeared to be killed, submitting to destruction in a way that seemed to confirm the Lord's absolute power. The rulers of death rejoiced. They had won. These troublesome visitors who had survived every trial house, who had disrupted their system, who had made them look foolish, were finally dead. The Lords celebrated their victory with the savage satisfaction of those who have seen their authority vindicated, grinding the twins' bones and scattering them in the river, just as they had done with one Hunahpu years before. But death could not hold them. This was the trick that shattered Xibalba's foundation. The twins' resurrection was not merely survival, it was a demonstration that the Lord's power was incomplete, that their domain had limits they had never imagined. Hunahpu and Xbalanque returned from death itself, appearing first as wandering magicians, performing wonders that drew the attention of all Xibalba. They demonstrated feats that seemed impossible, killing creatures and bringing them back to life, dismembering themselves and reassembling their bodies whole. The Lords of Death watched these performances with fascination, with desire, with the same hunger for spectacle that had always characterized their rule. And they made the fatal request. They asked the magicians to perform the ultimate trick on them, to kill them and bring them back. The twins agreed. And for the first time in the history of Xibalba, the resurrection did not happen. One by one, the Lords of Death submitted themselves to destruction, confident that the magicians would restore them as they had restored every other subject of their demonstrations. But Hunahpu and Xbalanque had no intention of bringing them back. The Lords died, truly and permanently, and the twins revealed themselves, standing over the corpses of Xibalba's rulers, as the same sons who had descended to avenge their father's murder. The Underworld's power structure collapsed in a single moment of calculated deception. The twins did not destroy Xibalba entirely. They left the lesser lords alive, but diminished, stripped of their authority to demand human sacrifice, forbidden from killing mere travellers who entered their domain. The balance between the upper world and the underworld shifted permanently. Death still existed, but it no longer served the ambitions of lords, who treated it as entertainment. Then came the final act of their journey. Hunahpu and Xbalanque ascended, not as mortals returning to the surface, but as celestial beings transforming into something greater than human. Hunahpu rose as the sun, and Xbalanque followed as the moon. The same twins who had outwitted death itself now illuminated the world from above, providing the light and the cycles that would govern all life thereafter. Their father's severed head, which had hung in the calabash tree in Xibalba for years, was restored and joined them in the sky. The family that had been broken by the underworld was reunited in the heavens, their story completing a cycle that began with creation's first attempt and ended with the establishment of cosmic order. And with that order established, the gods turned once more to the task that had defeated them 3 times already, the creation of humanity. But this time they found the material that had been missing from all their previous attempts. Maize, yellow maize and white maize, the substance that would finally carry the weight of consciousness, the medium that could hold a soul without cracking like mud or hollowing like wood. The Popol Vuh describes the gods grinding the maize, mixing it with the water of 9 grains and the blood of the serpent, forming a dough that became flesh, creating people who could speak, remember, understand, and give thanks. Why maize succeeded where mud and wood had failed is perhaps the most profound insight the Popol Vuh offers about human nature. Mud lacked structure. It dissolved under pressure because it had no internal coherence, no principle holding it together when circumstances became difficult. Wood lacked soul. It could perform the motions of living, but could not feel the meaning behind them, could not grasp the purpose of existence beyond mere survival. Maize, in the Maya understanding, was different. It was a cultivated substance, something that required human effort to bring forth from the earth. Planting, tending, harvesting, processing. It embodied the relationship between people and their environment, the mutual dependence that made both cultivation and civilization possible. The maize people were not created to exist independently of the world around them. They were created to participate in it, to maintain it, to sustain the cycle that gave them life. Their consciousness was not a gift granted without obligation. It was a capacity that came with responsibility, the duty to remember their creators, to honour the forces that made them, to participate in the perpetual renewal of the world that sustained them. The Popol Vuh's creation cycle was complete. First came earth and animals, beings without speech. Then came mud and dissolution, substance without coherence. Then came wood and emptiness, form without soul. Then came maize and people, material finally adequate to the purpose it was meant to serve. The story that began in the void before creation ended with beings who could tell that story, who could remember it, who could pass it down through generations until it reached us. The Maya understood themselves as the Maize people, the fourth and final creation, the ones who succeeded where three predecessors had failed. But their success was not guaranteed. The Popol Vuh made clear that creation could fail, that the gods' efforts could produce beings unworthy of the consciousness they received. The Maize people existed because maize could hold what mud and wood could not, but the story's message was never that humanity was inevitable. It was that humanity was contingent, dependent on the right material, the right circumstances, the right relationship between creators and created. And that relationship, like the maize itself, required cultivation to survive. And so the story folds back upon itself, completing the arc that began in the primordial void. 3 times the gods reached for creation, and 3 times their hands came away empty. The animals could not speak, the mud dissolved, the wood hollowed out into cruelty and emptiness. Each failure revealed something essential about what consciousness requires, not just form, not just motion, but substance capable of carrying genuine weight, genuine feeling, genuine responsibility. The Maize people succeeded because they were made from material that embodied relationship itself, cultivated substance requiring mutual dependence between humanity and the earth. And then there are the hero twins. Their journey through Xibalba was never just about revenge for a father's death. It was about fundamentally rewriting the terms of existence. By walking into the underworld and walking back out, by demonstrating that death's authority was not absolute, Hunahpu and Xbalanque transformed the universe from a place where endings were final into a place where endings could become beginnings. Their triumph didn't eliminate death. It placed boundaries around it. It made death part of a cycle rather than a permanent state. The sun rises because the twins ascended. The moon illuminates the night because they proved that darkness doesn't last forever. This is the Popol Vuh's deepest offering, the understanding that survival isn't merely about avoiding destruction, but about finding meaning that persists even when everything seems lost. The Popol Vuh has carried this meaning across centuries, surviving conquest, suppression, and the near erasure of the Maya world. It remains one of humanity's most profound creation narratives, a text that speaks to the contingency of our existence, the fragility of consciousness, and the possibility of renewal after catastrophe. Its stories aren't relics. They are living frameworks that continue to shape how communities understand their place in the cosmos. Thank you for listening to this journey through one of the world's great mythological texts. If you found value in this exploration, please like the video, leave a comment sharing where you are listening from tonight, and subscribe for more stories that reach across time. And remember following the show on Spotify, where the link waits in the description, is the very best way to support this channel and help these ancient voices keep speaking. Sleep well, and may the dawn always find you.